let's review for a moment, very quickly, where we are. We spent some time talking about what I've called Cartesian skepticism. What its characteristic form is, how it takes a certain sort of general shape, how it appears across a number of areas of philosophy, how they're different, as I put it, variants of that variety of skepticism. And we've done the same thing for Kantian skepticism. That is, we've just started again, looked at problems that come up in certain areas of philosophy. Notice a problem of another kind of shape. So far what we've been doing is, as it were, merely describing things that happen in philosophy, things that other philosophers have said, things that you can go out and find. So far not much of a philosophical claim has been made, other than descriptions. If the descriptions are wrong, if I've misdescribed a certain problem, or a certain problem doesn't come up, or hardly anyone talks about it, that seems a problem. But otherwise, there's just, as it were, a range of phenomena. Then what we did was start to try to characterize these things in somewhat more detail. And I did this by giving you a set of features. And one thing that came out extremely nicely in the exchange, anticipated things I wanted to say, but I want to use it since it happened, in the exchange at the end of class between Paul and myself about Scheffler and Goodman, and it led me to make some remarks about Kripke. One of the things we saw about these lists of features that you got 2 handouts ago, that would have been handout 3, I suppose, is that these lists of features don't necessarily exclude each other within a single philosopher's corpus. You can have a philosopher working on something that has a Kantian shape and then trying to immediately answer a Cartesian question. So that raises the question about what's happening. I suggest in the piece that I asked you to read for the last few classes that we might think of these 2 varieties of skepticism. Varieties is intentionally a weasel word. Now we're trying to figure out what varieties might mean. I introduce another weasel world, slightly more specific one, which we'll break down further. But we might think of these as genres of skepticism. And the reason to speak of a genre here is because I take it a genre as something that's characterized by features, but none of the features are necessary or sufficient. If you think about what makes something a Western, well, try it. There's lots of things you could name. If something takes place in the West, and it has horses, and it's good and evil, and there's a frontier, and they're setting up a civilization, and there's a bartender, and there's a sheriff, and I go on, I listen up these features, it's going to be a Western. But there isn't any one of these features that makes a movie a Western. You can have somebody who's a sheriff in it. And you can take anyone out. And in fact, a lot of what Western's about is what happens when the sheriff rounds up all the guns. Or whatever. That is, you remove a feature and see what the implications of it are for the other features. Another feature about genres, if I go and define another genre, say the romantic comedy or something, there isn't anything in principle that excludes the possibility of a movie that's both a Western and a romantic comedy. When you do try to cross genres, what you get is often a mess, aesthetically speaking. And that's an interesting fact, which we could take up in a different kind of class. But there isn't, as it were, a logical contradiction between mixing features. So what articulates a genre are certain kinds of features. The features do have a certain kind of coherence, much more than you might think. It's not an accident that, Westerns take place on the edge of civilization. And if you want to relocate a Western, you have to relocate it to a certain kind of a place in space and time in order to get, the same sort of structure, good and evil, etc. The same sort of incipient or fragile, as it were, conditions of civilization, both asserting themselves and threatening other to collapse, and so on. Similarly, with the features I gave you for these 2 kinds of skepticism, one of the things I tried to bring out as we went through them is that they're internally related. As we clearly articulated, one of the features that led to others. But what you certainly can get in a particular author's writings is an apparent cohabitation on the surface of these features. So one thing we're going to ask is, philosophically, what does that mean if that happens? That's the kind of question that's going to come up for us. It started to come up last class. I just wanted to flag it, since it started to come up last class, as an important issue. But I do want to put it aside for a couple more classes, and then we'll really look at that issue carefully. What I want to do today is look a little more carefully at Kantian skepticism, using the example of C.I. Lewis. And here's the reason I want to do what I'm doing today. I think Cartesian skepticism, and I think this itself is an important fact about it, which will bear thinking later on. I think Cartesian skepticism is, as it were, much more immediately gripping. What do I mean by immediately gripping? Well, one thing I mean is it happened earlier in the history of philosophy for each area of philosophy. I think that's not an accident. Another thing you might mean by immediately gripping, and I think this is just true, is try teaching undergraduates. You can get undergraduates gripped very quickly, at least puzzled, perplexed, in some sort of feeling of paradoxicality about a Cartesian variant of each of those problems. Try the other minds thing. It's not that you can't get them interested in Kantian skepticism in the same area, but it takes more work. And in particular, the more philosophy classes somebody's had, the easier it is to get them interested in the Kantian variant of skepticism. That is, Kantian skepticism itself, a feeling, a sensitivity for a problematic of that shape, itself depends upon a certain kind of sophistication, philosophical. It depends upon having worried about philosophical issues, a certain amount. Why that should be, again, is a question I'd like to take up. But so what I want to do today with C.I. Lewis in the context of philosophy of perception is help us see from within why a particular variant, important variant of Kantian skepticism can be gripping. I don't want to just do what I've done so far, which is describe the Cartesian case, describe the Kantian case, now it's different, but actually make you feel the grippingness of it. And in particular, what I want you to do is feel how a certain variant of Kantian skepticism can be gripping. What I mostly showed you last class was, here's Price, here's Lewis. Price is in a Cartesian problematic, as I put it. He's trying to answer a Cartesian skeptic. Lewis is in a Kantian problematic. But what we haven't really talked about yet was what it would mean if things from inside Lewis's problematic seem to start to fall apart. That is, trying to answer a question that looks like a question he's got to be able to answer also doesn't seem to be answerable. So that a genuine threat of Kantian skepticism, whatever that would be, starts to loom. So it actually seems like, not just something a philosopher invented in order to have someone to talk to, but something that starts to threat in the form that Kantian skepticism threats. As I've said before, what that looks like is not something that takes the form of a doubt. It has a different shape. And part of what I want to do is see more clearly what that shape is by looking more detail at this case. Now, I could have chose different cases. I think in some ways the easy way out here would have been to do it in a case of philosophy of language, because that's the version of Kantian skepticism in contemporary philosophy that people actually are most preoccupied and find most gripping. But I'd like to do it in philosophy of perception because I think that's actually historically, in this century, the one that initially exercised people more. And it's not an accident. If you go back and read all kinds of people in the late 19th and early 20th century. And I'll try to say a bit about how what we're looking at today is the background of a great deal of contemporary, at least Anglophone philosophy. And secondly, because I think it makes a nice pair with the form of Cartesian skepticism we've talked about the most in philosophy of perception, and that is most readily available to you probably. Also, I think it's easier to model the other versions of Kantian skepticism off of this as the paradigm example. So, trying to get Kantian skepticism to be gripping. So, let's see what it's like to be C.I. Lewis and get into trouble. Maybe one more preliminary note. Sorry for so many preliminaries. One other thing that's come up a couple of times in the class, which is an excellent question, which I'm also going to defer, really for only one more class now, is the question of how are Cartesian and Kantian skepticism related? We're just treating these as two phenomena. Here's a way you can pick up a problem. It starts to have this shape. Here, you can pick up the problem in a different way, and has a different shape. One of the things we saw last time is a lot of the same philosophical vocabulary. I wrote a lot of words on the board last time. Can even start to have a different kind of content. Words like object, consciousness, given, epistemic, directly present to, and so forth. All of that vocabulary starts to function in different register. But we haven't said anything about, well, how do you get from the one to another? Is this a coincidence? We'll start to take that question up next class. What I'm going to try to do today is just motivate Lewis's problem ab initio, as if Kantian skepticism just started in a philosophical vacuum, just as a worry about knowledge, experience, and so forth, as Cartesian skepticism does. That's how Lewis himself presents it in his book to some extent. But I will just add a footnote here and say, I think that's actually extremely misleading, what I'm doing. I do think it's not an accident that this kind of skepticism comes on the background of a prior problem. But for the purposes of simplification, I'll just try to motivate it as if it were self-standing problematic today. Okay, so here's a way of doing it. We're thinking about knowledge. We're Lewis. And we're looking at previous philosophy. We're realizing that things didn't go that well. The empiricists get into one kind of hopeless problem, he thinks. The rationalists get into another kind of hopeless problem. We talked about this last class. He, following Kant, doing something he takes to be following Kant, as I showed you, very many people do, taking themselves to be following Kant, while having a very different take on how to follow Kant in this respect. Say, the empiricists and the rationalists have made a common mistake. The way we saw Lewis put this last week, this is from page 25 of his book, is that their common error rests on a certain kind of impossible separation. They both want to separate a certain kind of contribution of the passive faculty of cognition, the sense, what it is to take things in sentiently, faculty of sensibility, as Kant talks about it. Exercises consistent intuitions, immediate representations. They want to separate that from the active faculty, the understanding, that has to then do something, work it out, contribute something to what comes in before it can be knowledge. In particular, introduce conditions of correctness and incorrectness, so that things can be such that what we think about how things are could be wrong. For them to be such that they could be wrong, there have to be normative conditions involved in the application of the thought. That involves a thought that's structured a certain way. It has to have the form of, if you will, X is phi, minimally. This is red. Such that things could be such that if things aren't red, I know that I've thought something false. So we already have Lewis developing a problem now in a Kantian form. He's not worried about given the things seem a certain kind of way. How can I have it really that way? But how could I even have an experience that has the form, this is red, X is phi, even if it's false? What does it take for experience to have that form? And one of the things he says it takes, Kantians will say it takes, is how he puts it, is concepts. And concepts have boundaries, and we could have other concepts. One of the things we do is refine our concepts. So our concepts are something we bring to experience. It's part of what to say they belong to an active faculty of cognition. And the question is, how are these related? And the generically Kantian claim, as I put it last time, was that without both of these conditions, we can't have knowledge. Each is necessary, neither is sufficient. And then I showed you how there are very many different ways to understand that generically Kantian claim. A different way to put that claim is to say that we need both of these faculties, and now the difficult thing to understand is their cooperation. And what's happened in both empiricism and rationalism is, instead of having a story about their cooperation, we've had a story in which one is the dog and the other is the tail. In empiricism, the dog, as it were, the thing that really, provides most of the force, the thing that gives us things that are incipiently or initially states of knowledge or awareness, is just what comes in. Those are already impressions. Those are already of things. From a Kantian's point of view, if you've got impressions of things, you've got the game. For Descartes, a thinking being enjoys ideas, res cogitans, has thoughts. Where do those come from? That's already been, we've already helped ourselves to that on the rationalist and empiricist sides, respectively. The empiricist then sees the ideas as in various ways being processed by the intellect. It sifts them and arranges them by principles of association. They get vaguer, become ideas, but therefore more general. But the crucial move's been made. The rationalist thinks the crucial case of knowledge comes with ideas we have for free. And then we need to hook those up with something outside. We need a circuit to the external world. But that circuit simply allows us to then come up with more ideas. But the capacity to have ideas that are substantively about something, that's something a non-sentient being should enjoy. So an empiricist thinks that intellection is not a condition on having an impression of something. And a rationalist thinks that our sensory capacities, empirical receptivity to the world, is not a condition on having a thought about something. Both kinds of philosophers take us to have representations that are, in the sense that a Kantian's worried about, vulnerable to how things are, simply through the operation of one of those faculties. And then they bring the other one to tell their whole story. Lewis thinks, no, you can't even have that, which each side is presupposing without already having a cooperation. That's what we saw him arguing, particularly on the empiricist side, as they tried to bring out, contrasting him with Schlick. But now, the question is, how do you tell this story without getting into trouble? What we saw when we looked at Lewis in more detail, Lewis being a nice person to look at, because I think he is very acute, he is very sensitive to problems, is it's very hard to tell this problem without falling into trouble, back into one of those two forms of trouble. So, Lewis wants to say, well, we can't have what the empiricists have. We can't have contentful impressions for free. So, what's the role of the senses? Well, if the senses just causally impinge on us, and that causes us to have some ideas or other, but all rational constraint just comes at the level of concepts. If what made my view of the world true is that it fit with all the other things I believe, and that's all it had to do, all my beliefs had to do is fit with my other beliefs, then Lewis worries, quotation 2, that we don't really have a story of the given, of empirical data. There's stuff that comes in that just causes stuff to happen. The empiricists have somehow turned these things that cause into things that give us content for free. He sees that's too much. But if we take that away and make it mere sensations that cause us, there be no, as it were, content given to the mind, what he calls here datum given to the mind, then knowledge must be contentless and arbitrary. There would be nothing which it must be true to. So our frame of beliefs has to be answerable to something outside of it. So I'm going to draw a picture. I didn't draw pictures when I was doing the Cartesian side of things, but I hope it's clear I could have. These pictures matter. I think these pictures themselves are, in a way, part of what's controlling each of these problematics. In the Cartesian shape, I was always, in my stories about Cartesian problems, I was always insinuating a picture. I was saying things like, well, if I'm dreaming, then things seem to me exactly as they do now. So on the inside, it's very hard not to say a word like that. On the inside, so here's the mind. And on the inside, I'm having my in front of a classroom experience. But on the outside, there's the world. And then how can I know from the inside that this relation between what's happening inside and what happens on the outside really matches? It looks like I need a view from here. Descartes actually explicitly introduces somebody who has a view from there. God. Well, the problem is, once we get rid of him, things start getting a bit hairy. How do we bootstrap ourselves out there? But so with the idea of inside and outside, with the idea of something like a veil or a screen, with the idea of something that happens beneath or behind, is a picture. Similarly, here's Kato. How do I know he's in pain? The way that the Cartesian problem goes, it also immediately involves a parallel picture with mind and world reversed. But the picture is, the pain is in the inside. It's part of Cartesian philosophy to always think that thoughts, experiences, pains, they are in some sense literally here. That's where they are. It's part of what makes materialism then such an attractive view. Because it keeps that part of the picture, but then it tries to make it seem unmysterious. Actually try to look for it. Once you start actually trying to look for in the brain, the thought, that blah, 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 all sorts of problems start to come up about what you think you're looking for, what the shape would be. Is the true thought and the false thought two different things you're looking for? And so forth. That's just the beginning of the problem. Once you start noticing that there's all kinds of different ways to express a thought in different notation. You don't need negation as a connective and so forth. And you start realizing it's only by fetishizing a particular form of expression of thought that you even think you have something to look for in that sense. Thoughts themselves are only articulated in relation to other thoughts. So there's a picture again of literally inside and so on. Cartesian pictures. But now what I want you to do is get a sense of Kantian pictures. So here the picture is, we have the realm of something like, now it's not the mind. It's not the right way to put it. If we think of the mind as something like a container or a self-standing realm, as the Cartesian is inclined to, or if we're doing say the second variant of Kantian Skepticism with the body is there thought of the container. It's in exactly the same state outwardly. It's psychologically neutral regardless of what's going on the inside. Here, we want to draw a picture. We're going to have to write something like the conceptual. It's a much more abstract picture. The conceptual. This includes things like the thought that there is an elephant in this room. It's a conceptual representation of something. Something's happening. But it's a thought I can think about this, which is conceptually articulated. It involves things like my having mastered the concept of elephant. Last time we taught a lot about the concepts fountain pen and cell phone, but same point. Those have to be acquired to think true or false thoughts in which they are ingredient. So we think of this as the conceptual, and then there is the given, something that has to be outside of this. And what we want to understand is this interface. What the empiricists did is tell a story in which the shape of our concepts come from the given. Something impresses itself on me. I have an impression of one cat, an impression of another cat. And Locke says, from these I abstract the general idea of cat. So the shape of the concept really just comes from the impressions themselves. They dictate the shape of the concept. It starts looking like you ought to be able to draw a picture of a general cat. Try doing it sometime. My general lecture, in my public lecture in a couple of weeks, I'll actually give a lecture in which we talk about Galton, in which he actually tried to give us photographic representations of general ideas. He's taking his empiricists very seriously. One of the nice things is you really see how the idea falls apart when you try to take it that literally. As it gets more general, there's also questions. If it's a picture, I give you a kind of nice schematic picture, and then I ask you, is it a picture of my cat, or cats, or Siameses? Or, is it a picture of the concept members of the cat family, which includes not only domestic cats, but lions, tigers, and panthers? As the picture gets more schematic, what would it mean for it to be a picture of one of those things rather than another? And once we start thinking much more abstract and general, like weighing over 100 pounds, what would it be like to cast that out in terms of a picture? So the empiricist idea is literally, it goes this way. This is a problematic. It's in previous philosophy, but it's now being thematized by the Kantians. That the given imposes the shape of the concepts. That gets into all kinds of problems. Problems that come up in contemporary philosophy under the myth of the given, as a species of the myth of the given. that some kind of sensory contact with the world could itself give you something that introduces the kind of normative constraint that a concept involves, with a particular sphere of application, certain boundaries, certain things fall under a certain extent, determinate contact. It's worth noticing that if that's what you think the myth of the given is, that's what many people say it is. You read Brandon's study guide to Sellars, he'll tell you that's what the myth of the given is. Then we already saw last class that Lewis is a critic of the myth of the given. We saw lots of quotations where Lewis was saying, the given cannot deliver that. We must have concepts too, or don't have any structure. So if the given were simply exhausted by that particular species of the myth, Lewis would go down in history as one of its critics. Actually, Lewis is a central target of Sellars in that book. So that means, and we've seen that he also wants to defend something he calls the myth. So that means there's other guises of the myth. Mikhail.
Yeah, sorry, I have questions, but only one.
Okay, unbelievable.
Okay. This argument is the same like the argument more or less of the Sellars, I guess. The critic of this myth of the given, of that something comes from the...
What I just tried to say, let me just repeat what I said is, if we thought Sellars' argument reduced to what I just said, that would be right. Many people think that of Sellars, and Sellars' thought wouldn't be no at all. But what I just tried to say is, that can't be right about Sellars.
Yeah.
Because then Sellars would have no criticism of Lewis. So what I've just said is that a standard reading of Sellars is just a footnote, completely misses Sellars' point. That's what I just tried to say.
Yeah. Okay.
So I haven't said anything actually about what Sellars is actually criticizing.
I'm just
in any deeper interesting. It's only the first few pages of Sellars you got.
Very good question now. This is, to my point of view, this is only trying to re-establish or to reinforce the whole Kantian project, but where is there the new thing in it? I can't see it actually.
Well, if that's all, well, first of all, I think Sellars isn't trying to do something new. He's trying to. Well, he takes himself to be explaining Kant.
He's like Hegel. That's my impression.
Right. But I think he thinks. Well, it's a question about the relationship between Kant and Hegel. Whether Hegel was trying to build on Kant, but he would certainly agree that this much is basic to the argument of the transinduction, or the first chapter of the phenomenology.
It's in Kant.
It's the first chapter of the phenomenology too. It's about the this in the beginning of Hegel. How can a this have determinate content? So it's in both of them. This much is in both of them. Whatever their differences are, Hegel learned this much from Kant. So I don't think he would be bothered by that question at all. He would just say, you got to read further in Kant and in Hegel and in me to get the differences. Okay. This is just very elementary. And as we've seen, this bit of elementary material is already in Lewis. He's learned this much from him too. But then, so the given can't do this by itself. Converse worry though, if we draw the arrow this way, so that was a story in which we say, this structure comes from here. There's some sort of impingement, and the shape of what comes in, you could draw little shapes if you want. Make little shapes over here if you want to make your picture very pictorial. The thing about philosophical pictures is if you fill them in too much, they get hard to draw. But that doesn't mean that they don't control your thinking in an inchoate form. It's one reason it's good to literalize the picture, to realize, what am I thinking if I try to fill this in? What is this line I'm drawing in thought? The other way to go, what Lewis thinks is a misreading of the idealists in the quotations we looked at last time, but the way many people he thinks have dismissed the idealists by misreading them, is to say, there is no constraint from the given. The given here means something that actually plays a role in knowledge, that offers constraint from, shall we say, the outside. That's part of this picture I'm trying to show you is working here, conceptually at some level. So, yeah, sure, something impinges on our senses. But constraint all comes from this side. We have concepts. Depending upon the concepts we have, if I teach you the concept red, rather than a language which has the concept mauve, vermilion, and scarlet, but doesn't happen to have a word for a color like red, that's unlikely since it's a primary color, so we should probably change that example slightly. But you can see how that would go. A case, sort of like, here's two German words, Stuhl and Sessel. Here's an English word, chair. There is no English word that divides quite like this. It's not obvious there's any German word that divides quite like this. We could introduce some word like Sitz, but that would actually be too inclusive. It would go beyond just these things to include benches and appropriately shaped stones and all kinds of things. So we can count, and if we ask how many, we'll get different answers depending on which concepts we have. So so on this view, we have some concepts. We bring another example I like very much is the French, rive and fleuve. In English we have a river. Creates a similar kind of problem. We don't have this distinction, and they don't obviously have a word that has quite this generality. So, if you have this kind of view, how you carve up the given is simply a function of your concepts. But this is where Lewis now worries. I understand the problem with the empiricists, but if you thought that there was no given that introduced constraint only came from the concepts. What would make these the right concepts rather than those the right concepts is just how they fit with the rest of your concepts. And there's lots of structures of concepts you can articulate. There's going to be something else that selects between them, which comes from, here's the picture. Now, outside. But notice, just as we saw last time, that words like directly present to, immediately in touch with, last class I was trying to show you, they function differently in a Cartesian or Kantian register. This language too, which will come up in both cases of inside, outside, functions differently in a Cartesian Kantian register. Actually, the picture has been changed. And you can easily miss this and see philosophers as directly addressing the same issue when they're not. Outside here means outside the realm of the conceptual. Something that passively impinges, but has not been authored by us. Inside means within the realm of conceptual. Something that has a kind of shape because it is in some sense a spontaneous human creation, something we brought to it. Be it a good way to sort or not. Be it locally something that says something true or not. Just that last clause is just to bring out the difference from the Cartesian problem there. So, what Lewis is saying in quotation 2 is the arrow can't go this way either. That's the bad reading ideals. And he thinks, he wrote his PhD dissertation on Fichte after all, he thinks that's not what the great Fichte and Kant and Hegel thought. That's just a bad way to read the idealists. They're not denying there is such a thing as the given. All they're denying is that the given without concepts, in good Kantian fashion, could be anything more than blind. So, here's our problem. We need somehow constraint coming in both directions. And that's where it gets hard to fill things in. This is what I said, where the problem is now to tell a story about the character of the cooperation that doesn't run into trouble. But the assumption that Lewis keeps, I'm going to bring out this assumption, comes out in your first quotation, is that the pure concepts and the content of the given are mutually independent of one another. That is, to put it in McDowell's language, what constrains the conceptual must lie outside the boundary of the conceptual. He thinks, if you will, in this picture, if I made this circle larger, I would fall into vicious idealism. Virtuous idealism is just denying the given. Virtuous idealism is denying that the given alone suffices. Vicious idealism is to deny the given. Virtuous empiricism, so Lewis is trying to be both an empiricist and an idealist. He's very explicit about this. And in contemporary philosophy, McDowell's another example of something he's trying to do this. People find this confusing. I think there's a sense in which this is already true of Kant. His vocabulary didn't work that way. The great truth in empiricism, Lewis thinks, and Kant, I think he thinks he's with Kant, is that the given experience, what comes in, must be, as McDowell puts it, some sort of tribunal. That's the virtuous thought of empiricism. Vicious empiricism, again, is to think this suffices. The vicious view in each case involves the common assumption of what we saw was the impossible separation last class. So the question is how to reconcile the virtuous assumption each without falling into the vicious virgin each. How do we do that? And the picture works. The crucial assumption here, which goes with the inside-outside language, is that this must constrain from the outside somehow. That's what he means by saying this and that do not limit one another. We must have genuine normativity. That means it's got to be constructed. You can't get that for free. You have a magical view if you think normative structure can just pop out of it. That's the kind of mistake the empiricists make. But you have this kind of structure is always blind. But there has to be constraint from the outside in our concepts. This kind of structure by itself, without any guidance from without, to take the picture literally again, makes this empty. These concepts empty. That's his way of understanding the real force of the dictum about emptiness and blindness, respectively, for concepts and intuitions if we don't have the right kind of cooperation. But now he's trying to understand how to flesh this out. And I showed you that he's critical of different ways of understanding that Kantian dictum. He thinks that these are too independent. You have the impossible separation. If you just say, both are necessary, neither sufficient. But you understand that, so you make the independence too great. You have the impossible separation. But if you make it too intimate, if you go Cassirer's way, in the quotation we looked at last time, in his reading of Kant, and you're too holistic, and you don't have it be the case that neither limits each other, then you fall into the problem of quotation 2, he thinks. So, how are we going to avoid this? And that's what we saw him trying to do. He's struggling to do that. What he wants to do is, here's a way of putting it in terms of the picture. He wants to get the realm of the conceptual and the realm of the given close enough. It's as if he's trying to move these together close enough that this can somehow impinge on or guide that. It doesn't just, as it were, bounce off it causally, but introduces some normative constraint. He's trying to interpolate something here that can allow a relation of guidance from the outside. But if he gets it too close, then it looks like he has the problem of quotation 2. And it's just the dog of the concepts waving the tail of what we take ourselves to experience. But it's just a function of the way in which, as Kant puts it in the Transcendental, we cannot help but think. And if we just think that way because we have those concepts and we can't help but think them, then Kant says that is to give the skeptic what he most desires. That problem is no problem of Kantian skepticism. If we wind up with the view that we now cannot see our experience as genuinely having empirical content, as being the kind of thing that could be true or false, as involving any kind of constraint, as either being merely blind or merely empty. The horns of that dilemma is what the shape of Kantian skepticism is. So Lewis thinks that can't be right. What you always think, if you're a Kantian, of course that can't be right. There's no question of the Kantian skeptic being right in a sense.
Excellent.
One sentence, I'll just finish this sentence. The only example I know of somebody who's sort of a figure for a kind of Kantian skeptic so far in philosophy, a full-blown one, Hume is a sort of half-blown one, and it's easier to think you can sustain the position if it's only half-blown. The only full-blown one I know is, the guy we might call Kripke. It's not an accident. It's not Kripke's position. And take it from me, it's not Wittgenstein's position. It's this position that Kripke's attributed to Wittgenstein, but he's not sure if it really is his, but he'll... So the only example of something that's actually pushing as a conclusion a Kantian skeptical line within some area of philosophy is someone that hasn't existed. It's not an accident, I think. But it doesn't make it any less pressing for all that. Sorry, I just want to finish that.
I just wanted to explain more about the phrase, the relation of guidance.
Yes, okay, good. Well, I'll put it more in Lewis's way. There's many ways to put this. A general way to put it, with respect to the philosophy of language case we had before, is if there's a mere mark, There's a shape of a sign or a word. What is it that makes this way of using it correct rather than that way? That's the way we already talked about in the philosophy of language context. But in the context of philosophy of perception, the way it comes up for Lewis is something impinges on me. I have an experience. I look here. It might be easier just to do this with simple concepts, or like colors for a moment, instead of something complicated like self-learning fountain pen. I wish this was a more uniform color. Excuse me, whoever this might be. I can only see this part of the hat. Here I want to use the concept silver. Here I want to use the concept green. I want to say, that is silver. That is green. I also want to say, assuming the lighting's fine, my eyesight's fine, all that stuff, which we can start worrying about in a while, and get back into a Cartesian problem. I'm right. This is silver. That is green. And now Lewis's problem is, in virtue of what? There must be something that I'm taking in that licenses the application, the concept silver here. It licenses the application of the concept green here. There has to be something coming in that makes this concept the right one to use here, that concept the right one to use there. And he wants to say, that itself won't constrain the conceptual unless it's unbounded, unless it's outside the conceptual, unless it itself is dictating which concepts to use. It wouldn't ground my use of concepts unless it was outside my use of concepts. But he's also very acute. He realizes all the problems with classical empiricism that start to become clear in Kant and Hegel and so forth. So he realizes a particular thing, an object in the world, can be classified 1,000 ways. This can be classified as round, silver, larger than a tomato, in a million other ways, including like concepts I don't have. A thing can't make that right. It has to be something more than a thing. It has to be there has to be something that has not the structure of a particular, but something that has some structure of generality, such that this is a case of silver. This and this and this and this is silver. I have to be putting this together with other things for this to be silver. A single thing in itself can be brought under any concept or not, if the concept only has a single instance. In a sense, something that only one thing falls under, you can't call anything else that, is, if you will, a proper name, not a concept. And learning somebody's name is learning something that's been stipulated, learning something that's true or false. So he realizes there has to have some generality. If this is going to constrain that, it has to have some character of generality. This is already a problem in the empiricists. They want impressions to be atoms, sensory atoms, particular items, that then have a certain kind of bearing that no particular can have. So he realizes there has to be generality here, and that's why he draws his distinction, which we will come to in a moment. Again, we talked about this briefly last time, between a quale and a concept. There has to be something that comes from the level of the senses, such that when I see one of these that has this quality, and I see another one of these that has this quality, there's a problem here, right? I can't name the quality and say silver. Lewis will immediately point out, as he does in your reading, that's already to employ the concept silver. We're trying to get something more basic. And he thinks in principle undescribable, for reasons we'll get into. Any of you have read Wittgenstein's private language argument will realize Lewis is heading right into the teeth of it. But I'm trying to give you some sense of why there's a deep reason people head into the teeth of it. And that it has a Kantian structural motivation. The deep version of the private language argument is directed at a certain kind of Kantian skeptical problem. It tends to be construed as if the worry was simply a certain kind of Cartesian. So there's got to be some way to recognize this as the same again. There's something which, in employing my senses, I see this, and I look and employ my senses, and in some sense I can see this as the same as that. I can see they're qualitatively the same. If I didn't have that ability to look at green, and look at some other green, look out the window at some grass, there wasn't some recognitional capacity to see those as qualitatively alike that was grounded in senses. He thinks there wouldn't be anything that was really anchoring our use of the concept when we employed the concept and said green each time. Then we would just be, this would be disconnected from that. It would, to employ a metaphor of McDowell's, we would just be frictionlessly spinning in, to add a word, a conceptual void, without any resistance from something outside. To employ another metaphor, the world itself would have no voice, no normative voice, would offer no guidance in how we employ our concepts. So, that's what I meant. That's an attempt to be slightly more precise, Dixon, about what I meant when he said there has to be guidance coming from the given. I think we should take a break, come back in 10 minutes. Let's look at where we are with respect to the handout now. So what you have in quotation 3 on the handout is what he says right after the thought experiment of the fountain pen that we looked at last time. In the thought experiment of the fountain pen, we had the thought experiment of 3 different kinds of people being presented with a certain experience. Professor Clarence, experience of a fountain pen. Child, experience of a smooth, biteable, excuse me for a moment. The savage, from the beginning, presented with a peculiar, possibly man-made, possibly divine artifact. Unlike Schlick, Lewis thinks there's no way to strip away the concepts and just get at the given itself. The fountain-like, pen-like character, or Schlick talks about that blue character, whatever. No, our experience of it goes through our concepts. The savage's concept goes through his concepts. Even a little baby, if he can think at all, has his own, as Lewis calls them in one place, proto-concepts. So you can't strip them away. So he's not trying to get you face to face with bare qualia. He doesn't think you can do that. But what he's trying to show you is that there must be qualia. And what the qualia are not that they have exactly the same sensuous experience. He realizes that can't be right either. Both for empirical reasons and because it wouldn't help. Because it was just something particular. It wouldn't be able to play this guiding role. But that there must be something qualitatively the same at the level of the character of sense experience across these 3 experiences that grounds the concepts. Our concepts themselves wouldn't give us knowledge of something outside the concepts themselves. It wouldn't give us a vulnerable picture of the world, to borrow that metaphor. So, he says, what he's trying to get here is the character of the thing as a merely presented colligation of sense qualities. That's what I was trying to work at. That's an attempt to gloss what he's trying to show us that there must be. He's not trying to introspectively get you to isolate this apart from the concepts. We saw last, he thinks you can't do that. Experience is always thick. That's one of the many things the empiricist is wrong about. So the argument is a much weaker one. He's trying to keep the grain and truth in empiricism while rendering it immune from all of the attacks from the idealists. He's trying to say that the grain of truth is that there must be something qualitatively the same at the level of sense that grounds these differences, even though each of them from within will have an experience that's structured by their concepts, and that's all they can have. But if we want to say their concepts are right, and we even want to say things like, when the native says, uses his word for artifact, he can't experience it as a fountain pen. He says, but artifact, well, he's not wrong. Any more than I'm wrong in saying this is a chair, and McDowell says this is a stool. We don't decide which of us is right. even if we start counting in a room which has complicated furniture, we might get different answers because the concepts have different extensions. So that's just the first line of that quotation. You had a question.
Yes, small remark. In my view, there's a sort of problem hidden here because 3 examples Lewis is used with or he has mentioned with the savage and you and another person. And you also mentioned a child. And my question is, a child may have proto-concepts if they have like a sparse repertoire of concepts, but what influence? And the next question, what about animals? Take a monkey, for example. What would Lewis say to that? Because that's a big discussion now, like discussing.
Definitely. There's a number of issues here. First of all, one of the things I'm going to try to show you by the end of today is that there's a big problem here. So I agree. First, I'm trying to make Lewis seem sympathetic. You can see why there's a problem. But I also want you to see there's a problem, because that's when you have Kantian Skepticism, when there's a problem, not just a solution. So I'm trying to bring out the problem. But I will just answer, so that's the main thing I want to say in answer to your question, is there is a problem. We're going there. But just to say a couple of short things. Now, I don't think Lewis is very satisfying about animals. Lewis is, in this respect, he thinks they don't really have concepts. And so he thinks they don't really have experience. So you have a story about how it is they're guided by the world. But he really does want to see that as a story in which the constraint is causal. They don't have thoughts that are correct and incorrect. That's what he'll say about animals. Now, that makes it a very big gulf. I also think some of the things he says about children are quite problematic by some ways. It's hard, and if you want to be a certain kind of Kantian, the way Lewis says, children are hard to think about. Because you can't have one concept on Lewis's view, and you can't have two concepts. You can't have three concepts. You need all of the color concepts. You need the concept that they are colors. And if you start thinking about it, you need to be able to distinguish something's being a color from something else in order to have the concept of a color. And so it's looking like in order to have any concepts, you need a lot of concepts. And so how light dawns gradually over the whole for the child becomes a real problem for someone like Lewis. What the way in could look like. And he definitely, and what some of the things he says about children make it very hard to see what a proto-concept would be. It's hard to see how you have a half of a concept. It's a little bit like being almost pregnant. It doesn't look like there's a way to be just almost there. It looks like it's in or out.
Well, I was also asking because like, the term proto-concept is also used by Putnam.
Oh yeah, and these are problems. I mean, these problems that Lewis is in are all over contemporary. Part of the interest of Lewis is he is, I think, one of the people that really thought through the shape of the problems so that the agenda we have now is coming into view here. And I think that's part of why it's interesting, to see what it looks like when it comes into view in its relatively, as it were, unnaive, unprofessionalized, uncomplicated, speciated, colonized form. So that's part. But one of the things I'm going to say at the end of today is you can see lots of contemporary issues springing out of this. That's absolutely right. That's part of my point. Looking at this before we look at Putnam and McDowell. Exactly right. But I do think that it is right that if you have something like Lewis's view of concepts, then concepts are going to go the way, as the American expression says, of horseshoes and hand grenades. It looks like almost isn't going to do you a lot of good. You have to either it's a hit or it isn't. There isn't some way to just almost be there. So you can't have the pin almost out of the hand grenade. So it's almost exploding. I didn't kill him, but I didn't just miss him either. I almost. That's just nothing. Till the pin's out, it's nothing. And until you got a concept, it looks like in Lewis's view you got nothing. And so children are hard to think about that. Because you need that, because it turns out to have a concept, you need the conceptual. So animals are out of the game, and it's not clear how children go from being animals to something else. All true, all for later. But that, I think, is really, that developmental problem, though, I actually think, this is a big claim, to believe this, but I actually think that's just really a species of the problem we have here, in synchronic rather than diachronic form. Just like the problem about the intention, how can the intention be the cause? And we've got things temporally distinct, and we haven't put ourselves as a causal story. Just makes vivid a feature of a problem of the story we already have in synchronic form in the other versions of Cartesian skepticism. So I think it's absolutely right that that problem is relevant here. I don't think it's structurally different, which is, if the concepts just come for free, how could anything that happened before take you into the concepts in a way that would be interesting? That's just sort of, as it were, something that's sort of happening in a moment here is being slowed down as a process of development. I don't think it's a different problem. I think you're quite right. I think it's a related problem. And if Lewis has a problem here, he's going to have a problem there. What I think is right about Lewis is he really sees this problem, and he sort of sweeps that problem under the rug. But I think you're right that you should be just as worried about the one as the other. That I think is true too. Okay. So now, just a little bit about quail. So what Lewis wants to say then is there has to be a quality of sense that is the basis of the application of concepts. It's going to be the basis of the application of the concepts. One of the things he sees is that the aspect of sense we're talking about has to have some generality. It has to be when I see this and I see this and I see this. I see all of those things as relevantly like each other in such a way that all of them merit the application of the concept green. We're only going to have guidance if we have some structure of generality that we're latching onto to experience. So what he wants to do is grant all of the idealist claims about the conceptual and how it has to be spontaneous and so forth. We have to bring it. It involves arbitrary boundaries and so forth between concepts. And then say, but there's another kind of generality. So there's being the instance of a concept. That's the thing we understand well in philosophy. And then there's being the instance of a quail. The problem with the traditional empiricist notion of impression, Lewis will now say, is it confuses these two. Locke will say, we have an impression of a triangle. We can't have anything of a triangle unless we have the concept of a triangle. That's something an impression. But there's got to be something which we can talk of as in an impression of way. One of the things that Lewis will say, and Sellars will be even clear about this later, is that even this of functions differently. The kind of relation this is, the kind of nexus of instance caught up in some more general thing itself determines the meaning of the of. So this of is itself something we need to understand. But so there's something which is being an instance of a quail. The level of sense experience, if we drop, and if the savage looks away and looks back again, if I look away and I look back again, we can both recognize that as the same again, which leads us to put, or if it disappears and then we find it again. A wind blows, then we have to run after it and find it, and we see it as the same again. There is that which is qualitatively the same in both our experiences. The savage sees it's the same again, uses the same concepts, uses it of something. So a recognitional capacity. But this recognitional capacity has to be, he thinks, prior to concepts. So this is all Lewis working really hard to import some substance to this notion of guidance. Because he's afraid, unless we give some substance to this notion of guidance, unless we can make out this arrow in this direction, not just this arrow in this direction, but this arrow in this direction, to have some normative character and not a merely causal character, we are going to be left with the problem of quotation 2. So, say, we'll go a little further, but let's just stop for a moment and say Lewis fails. Lewis is trying hard to tell a story like this. But say you were to say to Lewis, you fail. And what's more, you must fail. There's no way to tell this story. What would that mean to Lewis? That would mean something like, you're telling me that we have these concepts and there's nothing that guides them? Or you're telling me stuff just comes in and causally impinges and that magically... You either have a story in which there's no empirical content, you have the problem of quotation too, or you have the problem of traditional empiricism, where you incoherently and magically help yourself to things that have the shape of ideas. There's something like written into the character of experience themselves. So what you have there then, if there's no way to tell the story, is what I was calling a Kantian boggle. It looks like the very experience we're trying to explicate is something that there's no way to make sense of the possibility of having. That's what would happen if you couldn't tell us. So, from Lewis's point of view, there's got to be a way to tell a story. And Lewis is trying, this is part of why I think it's interesting, he's trying to be as careful and minimal about this as he can. So he's saying, there's got to be constraint. All I mean by the given. So let's look at quotations 4 and 5. I'm going to get a little ahead of myself. So quotations 4, we have him introducing the idea of the quail. Now he's being a little unstrict here, I should point out. He corrects himself later. He says, this content of a specific quail, such as the immediacy of redness or loudness. But a couple of you I know from our discussion will say, loudness and redness are concepts. Those can't be descriptions of the content of the quail. And he says that later on, as you'll see. There's a kind of loose way of talking, which then has to be taken back. The fact that you say things that you have to take back is very much a sign that you're in a Kantian problematic. The very describing of the problematic involves saying things and then saying, well, actually I didn't quite mean it that way. Kripke has this problem, the Churchlands have this problem, Rorty has this problem, Brandom has this problem. Philosophers who are working the Kantian problematic, they tell you what their issue is, and they say, well, that looked like it. But actually, we weren't literally talking about commitment at that point, because commitment involves these things. We're talking about another kind of normative constraint that's less than full commitment, that grounds it. So you have something you seem to be talking about, you find, well, you weren't actually talking about that, but that was a way in. And then later on, we see why it wasn't that. What would it have been like to just start out saying something that you didn't have to take back? Very unclear. Is that a problem? Maybe not. Maybe. The presentation of event is unique. The qualia that make it up are not. They are recognizable from one experience to the next. Such specific qualia and repeatable complexes of them, I think he's thinking of certain phenomenologists here, certain American followers of Husserl, are sometimes called essences. This term with such a meaning will here be avoided. The liability to confuse such qualia with universal concepts makes this imperative. We can't take this universality to be anything like the universality of concept, or we wouldn't have respect to the point of quotation 1. We need to get it close enough so there can be constraint, but far enough so that neither limits the other. So we have independent external constraint. We need constraints, so it can't be too far. We need external constraints, so it can't be too close. And the question is, once you start working this picture, can you do that? Once you start getting close enough for constraint, a worry's going to be, but this kind of constraint's collapsing into that kind of constraint. You start trying to tell a story, so you pull this far enough, parts of these are really independent. It stops looking like this normatively bears on that. That's a very quick description of a kind of dilemma that Lewis is in, that he's trying really hard to avoid. What any concept denotes, or any adjective such as read around, is something more complex than the identifiable sense quotation 5. So there he's already admitting that any description of this is not just a description of the qualia, but of something more. We always see them back through the light of our concepts. And he gives a number of reasons why this is true. A first reason is that the qualia themselves don't have time span, they're always in a minute. More important, though repeatable in experience and intrinsically recognizable, they can have no names. Anything that has a name is articulable and recognizable at a level that involves concepts. So he's realizing not just they're not concepts, but the particulars we can talk about, we can only talk about because they fall under concepts. A further deep Kantian point. If you didn't know things like Richard was a person, Fido was a dog, you wouldn't be able to keep track of Fido as that particular. So the sense in which we can isolate the given is only in an abstract sense. It says in quotation, it's only available through a certain kind of philosophical reflective activity of abstraction. Quotation 8. We can thus isolate the element of the given by these criteria of its unalterability and its character as sensuous, feel, or quality. We cannot describe any particular given as such. Since we get into description, we always have more than the merely given. Because in describing whatever fashion, we qualify it by bringing it into some category or other. Any concept is going to have some conceptual shape or fall under category. That's very annoying. Did I say something wrong? I won't do it again. So he says, in a sense, the given is ineffable, always. Is that which remains untouched and unaltered, however it is construed by thought. This is his attempt, as I put it, to try to be very minimal. He's trying to say, look, there's got to be something that we don't control. We, in a sense, author our concepts. We could change the shape of our concepts. We could realign our cover vocabulary if we wanted to. Scientists do constantly realign their vocabulary for how to talk about the most basic things. In the history of civilization, languages have done this. But there's got to be something, an experience, which we don't control, which anchors the use of the concepts, or there wouldn't be any sense to be made of the idea that our perceptual experience of the world is right or wrong. So, he says, that's the given. It's given to us. We cannot deny that. He thinks that's a minimal claim. And he thinks it's also a minimal claim that this must in some way guide. If it just causally impinged, that would be nothing. It can't causally impinge and for free give us impressions of triangles without already having the concepts of it. So the concepts come from there, but this must somehow guide them. That, he thinks, so far is also not to claim anything. He's trying to be very careful. And he said, but how does this guidance go? We wouldn't have guidance unless we had some kind of generality in the structure of the given. That's the claim nothing, he thinks. This is vocabulary for just making that assumption explicit. So Lewis thinks he's taking baby steps here. There's more philosophy to do. But he's just taking baby steps. You can't really deny any of this. Or what? Or the lights would go out. That's my way of putting what Kantian skepticism would be. We wouldn't have any experience. We wouldn't even have false experiences. Kant says, we did not have this much unity. Things that were structured this way, they can be of things, such that they have objective validity, they have purport. We did not have that much. Kant says we would have less than a dream. That's Lewis's point. And he's trying to say, what are the conditions of less than a dream? And he thinks he's, as I also said, following Kant. That's a further claim. Yes, Dixon. Yes.
I'm still thinking about this idea of guidance.
Yes.
What happens in this case? For example, we have a concept we get from the given. Let's give an example of maybe a species that gets extinct will remain the concept when the species is no more. And secondly,
well, that's no problem at all. I mean, that's a Cartesian. You might say that's a Cartesian problem. How do we know certain things exist? The issue here is how can you have? We have the concept of a unicorn.
Let me first finish the other side.
Right. Okay, sorry.
Then the other side is the given that come from the concept. For example, we, out of scientific imagination, we developed the idea maybe of a dinosaur or something. Yes. And we've created it. It's coming from a concept and it's coming a given. And concepts, maybe secondary concept, originate from it. So I don't know whether this relation still exists.
This is a more fundamental question. I mean, you're really back in the Cartesian question. Horses exist. I think that's true. You can show your horse. Unicorns exist. I think that's false. But we can look into it. Unicorns are the horses that are supposed to have the horns. But both these questions take for granted that the thought horses exist have a bearing in the world. We know how to sort, we can, as it were, when we say that's a horse, there is, or that's not a horse, there's some way the world is, that can bear on what we're thinking. That, and Cartesians wonder, when we have such thoughts, are they true or false? Lewis's question ultimately is, how can we so much as think either of these thoughts? The thought that horses exist as a false thought. Say we believe, what are we doing when we even do that? We're still assuming that there's some way that when we apply the concept unicorn, there is a rightness and wrong to it. It bears on something outside of experience. So it's got to be, when you see a horse, and you say horse, there's got to be something about what you see and what you think that connect them. How can there so much as be a connection, even a bad connection? That's the question. So that's one of the reasons I'm doing this is because I think this kind of Kantian problem is harder to understand. It's much the kind of Cartesian question where one says, well, this is true, but now how do we know that? How do we really know that this is true? That's the easier philosophical question. And what I'm trying to do today, maybe not especially, is bring out a completely different kind of problem, this time within perception, which doesn't have the structure, which makes all of this, as I put it when we're having the features, equally problematic. The very fact that you choose an example like dinosaurs or unicorns, that's a good case. You know, we had this stuff about examples and choosing your examples for Cartesian skepticism. That's a good case for Cartesian skepticism. It makes an issue of existence. Does it really exist? Pressing. If you have a Kantian problematic, it doesn't matter what your example is. You don't have to go to the unicorns and the dinosaurs. The cell phones, the hats, colors, anything, any concept. We lose all our concepts at once if we can't make sense of this relation of guidance. We lose every concept. We lose the concept of the concept. we lose our ability to make sense, that we understand what we're saying when we ask the question, are there any concepts? That's what I mean by saying the lights go out. If this doesn't make sense, we're not even capable of dreaming. We can't even get that much unity going in our perceptual experience. So the worry, and there's a sense in which you can't imagine that's how things are. There isn't anything which is imagining that. It's sort of like trying to imagine you're dead. There isn't anything to imagine. I mean, there is no you left if the Kantian skeptical problematic. You're not still in the picture, just having no thoughts. Part of who you are is a possible subject of experiences and thoughts. You go as a self along with everything else. But the problem is, if you have Lewis's problem, is it's hard to see how there can be something that has, in this case, if we're talking about philosophy of perception, the character the perceptual experience does. If it's language, the semantic character language has, and so forth for the various variants. This is why it's very intuitive. The point of Kantian skepticism isn't you imagine what it would be like if the Kantian skeptic is right. You can't do that. That's why I say it's not a doubt. The character, if you're wrong, isn't one of disappointment. Gee, I can imagine it. That would be great, but we can't have it. It's not like that. But still, if you start with the kind of considerations Lewis is starting with, and they seem minimal, and you get into trouble, then you do boggle. A philosophical bind of a certain sort comes in. But it's one about how we can have concepts, all of them at once.
I just want to remark, to me it seems that this realistic rest of the given is working quite the same, or is the same, like what in Kant's philosophy is the Ding an sich. Is this, how do you answer this question?
Well, I think the one problem with that is with respect to the issue of the relationship between sensibility and understanding last cast, I showed you 4 different readings of Kant. 4 different ways of saying, these are both independent of each other, neither is sufficient, both are necessary. There's at least as many readings of the Ding an sich. I think most readings of the Ding an sich, if you look at secondary literature, are actually quite wrong because they're Cartesian. As most people think the Ding an sich is something like an object that impinges on us, and then we have an experience, and we call the experience the phenomenon. And then how do we know behind the phenomena there really is that Ding an sich? And then Kant's often read as saying, we can't say anything about it. And that's a Cartesian problematic, I think. And moreover, it's to make Kant out to be a Cartesian skeptic, I think. So I think it's a bad reading of Kant, but it's the most common. But once you get rid of that and you put Kant in a Kantian problematic, as these people all were for sensible understanding, that doesn't tell you how to read the relationship between das Ding an sich and an Erscheinung. It's still, there's as many readings of that as there are about this issue. Those things go together. Kant says, in the preface to the B edition, that an appearance is a concept that doesn't make a sense unless there's something that appears. So, the things in themselves as appearances are those same things talked about in 2 ways. So, you suggest the Ding an sich isn't another thing that's behind the appearance. The Ding an sich is that which appears. So I think most people, at least in the Kantian problematic, will have that much straight. But then there's still a question about how you do that, how you tell that story. There's several versions of that. We could talk about it, but it would take us astray. But I think Lewis, but the Das Ding an sich in Kant, I think if you're reading carefully, as actually one problem is it can mean more than one thing. The expression, I think, has a univocal reference in Kant. Sorry, it has a univocal sense in Kant, but not a univocal reference. It's a comparative thing. There's a thing in itself, the thing in relation to other things. That's a comparative term, like bigger than.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't have a single reference. It has a single sense. Then there's the thing in itself versus the thing in its relation to a cognizing subject. That's a more specific relation. And then I think in Kant's philosophy, that's speciated in many ways. Sometimes the rain is the thing in itself, the rainbow is the appearance. That's one way of using the vocabulary in one context. The important way of using it in the context of the theoretical philosophy, in the context of the first half of the critique and the analytic, those are 2 important qualifications, is as what he calls the negative concept of the noumenon. The negative concept of the noumenon is we consider the object of knowledge and abstract out from it any cognitive contribution we make, sensible or intellectual. That's the negative concept of the noumenon. What can we say about it at that point? Kant says, nothing. I don't think he says we can't know anything about it. He's very clear about this, actually, in the second edition. To say we can't know anything about it would be to talk about it as a kind of object. He says a great mistake is people act as if the negative concept of the object were a determinate kind of funny object about which we cannot know anything, rather than realizing that what we have is an indeterminate concept of an object. That's one that cannot support the concept of knowledge. But the point is the negative concept of the noumenon, which is probably the most important, but only one of 20 things he means by das Ding an sich, is something from which we have abstracted all our cognitive contributions. That's not what Lewis means by the given. The given involves sensibility. We're abstracting out the intellectual contribution, but not the sensible contribution. That is a topic that Kant talks about in the critique, as Lewis knows, but not under the label das Ding an sich. Because it's not das Ding an sich, it's das Ding als sinnliche Erscheinung. That's what we're talking about here. The abstraction only involves the concepts, but it's not abstracting from our cognitive powers altogether. What we're interested in is what sensibility contributes on its own. Not what the thing contributes on its own. But he thinks unless sensibility made a contribution on its own, the thing would not constrain our concepts. So we are interested in the relationship between the concepts and the things. But the given is not a name for the things. It's a name for a certain aspect of how things appear sensible.
Yeah, but just one answer to that. To me, it seems that what we're speaking about, the given, it's not reachable. We can never just subtract our.
Lewis totally agrees. He's absolutely clear. Lewis totally agrees. He's absolutely clear. Exactly. He's absolutely clear about that point.
That's not that.
He's absolutely clear about that. It's not a criticism of Lewis. Lewis's argument is, you can't ever get at the given itself. That's why we need this concentrated experiment of the thought experiment of the pen, where we have three cases and we say, there must be something in common. We can't get at it. We can only get at fountain pen. That's why it's so complicated for us. That's why it's not like Christ. When his argument is, there must be a given. We can see this reflectively. This is, as you might put it, a transcendental posit.
Yeah, it's just a postulation.
Right. That's that, right. No, it's not just a postulation.
It seems like.
It must be, else we would not have. That's the tone here. Postulations, there might be, now let's do experiments or something. Here it's, there must be, or you couldn't do experiments. So it's a posit in some sense, but it is gazettes, as Fichte will say. It's not an accident that his dissertation's on Fichte, but that's not to say it's a mere posit. That would be to suggest that there's some other way at this. Let's get at the problems here. We got 7 minutes, and I have spent all of my time making Lewis plausible and powerful, but I want you to also worry about him. I want you to see, this is someone who is thinking hard. It's not that he doesn't see the problems. If things don't work where they don't work here, there's trouble. There's big trouble. All of the philosophy is happening today, I think. I could draw a map with respect to this problem and place Davidson, McDowell, Brandom, Sellars, and lots of other philosophers, Evans, within the space of trouble that is here. They're all philosophers arguing about how to get out of the problem, if there's a problem. Some people saying, you have to tell this story of guidance differently. Other people saying, you have to tell this story of guidance differently, essentially what Sellars and Evans in their very different ways do. Other philosophers saying, as long as you have guidance of this sort, you'll always have a version of the myth of the given. That's what Brandon and Davidson both say. But then people say to them, but then you have just the problem that Sellars says you have, that Lewis says you have a quotation too. You have a kind of coherentism, which grounds nothing. Then you have McDowell say, well, the boundary of the conceptual can't have an outside. It is not bounded. And then people look at McDowell and say, we don't know what that means. And so all of those philosophers are arguing about a problem that takes its root here. Now, let's see sort of locally how the problem... Well, one thing I just wanted to bring up, quotation 11 on the handout, reply from Firth. I just wanted to... I don't have time to read those now. It turns out I was going to. But what you'll see if you read this, I just think it's good to have the mood of this. I have chosen, maybe I'll just read you one sentence in the reply to Firth. I have chosen this name, the given, as having minimal implications of anything beyond the character of it as dado and immediate. If you don't like the word given, choose some other name. But let us not abdicate to those who think that if we can be prevented from using any word which applies to immediate experience or any factor, we may immediately forget there is such a thing. Backing up, 4 lines down in 665. Anyone who wished to say about the did not understand what was so denoted by this term, the given, would have been regarded as a candidate for the booby hatch. I quoted that last time. This is just, I'm trying to make it graphic how Lewis thinks if you deny the bit he wants here, you're saying something that makes no sense. You're saying our concepts aren't in any way grounded in what their concepts are. He's trying to tell a minimal story of grounding or grounding. He knows this isn't very philosophical satisfying. There has to be more work. He's just trying to take the baby steps. You can't deny any of these baby steps. But the problem is, immediately, in philosophy, the next generation, as philosophy students often do to their teachers, turn on him and do say the baby steps were too big. Took too many steps, Clarence. The first step was too big a step. But the way they really, but the place the pressure really comes is right here. So a famous locus of criticism here, historically in the 50s, which then got lost in the popularization of it. The reason it got lost is people didn't want the problem, I think, to come clearly into view again later, was in something like 2/3 of the way through. And only once you get 2/3 of the way through Sellars' empiricism and the philosophy of mind. Sellars tries to make explicit what the assumption here is by saying, what you have to assume, and he points out the empiricists, the more subtle empiricists, Berkeley and Locke, already had an assumption like this. What you have to assume is what he calls repeatable sense determinables. There has to be some way to say, this is a case, there has to be somewhere where you can experience something as a case of this quail. A case of this quail. Something that has a structure of a determinable. Like cat. Cat is a determinable. If I ask you, what color is cat? There's no answer to that. Any particular cat is a particular color. The cat is a determinable. It's a concept. It's not itself fully determinate. It is further determined. Any instance of it is fully determinate. It's part of what Kant means by saying concepts are general and immediate. And what we want is something that is in sense itself, that has the structure of a determinable. We want to be able to say, here's this thing in sense that can be further determined, but it's just there in sense, having this character of a determinable. And it's repeatable. I can recognize it as the same determinable again. And what Sellars is going to argue is, bracket this word, there isn't anything which has the structure of a repeatable determinable that isn't itself already a concept. This is the structure that comes with full-blown thought. We're abstracting a feature of judgment out when we judge that X is phi. We want something to have the determinable character of a phi. And we're projecting that then onto a feature of our capacities that's supposed to be prior to and independent of our capacity for thought. We're projecting a shadow of a conceptual structure onto something which is itself supposed to be inherently non-conceptual. And so this sets up a problem in philosophy, which is, can there be a kind of content that guides conceptual content, which is non-conceptual, but isn't itself, when we tell the story about what non-conceptual content is, just a way of projecting the shadow of concepts back a level while pretending we've got something that's independent. And that's a debate that's raging right now. And there's two sides to it, and people keep telling stories, and people keep saying, no, in a more subtle way, you've imported a feature of conception into your story of mere sensation. And the other people saying, no, that's a kind of informational content that we can get into this description, which later on, and so forth. But the whole structure of this debate comes from trying to find something that can do this work that's immune to this criticism. Was it really that time? Well, I'll take 2 minutes. I'll draw one more little picture on the board. I think it might help bring out the problem. Might help to interpolate some levels here. So this is just perception. A case of Kantian skepticism. But my claim is you see this structure throughout Kantian skepticism. So again, this is a picture. When I draw pictures, Cartesian pictures coming, I'm asking you to trust them. I'm just trying to map a philosophical shape. If we really focus on the picture and you become suspicious of it, all the better, as far as I'm concerned. But on this picture, we have something like the objects over here. Then we have sense. We have some layer of sense. And sense looks like it's an unacquired capacity. It's something we just have. And then over here, we have experiences. Perceptual experiences. And then we have beliefs based on those perceptual experiences. They're sometimes called non-inferential beliefs. We just have them in the virtue of having experiences. I get a telegram, I conclude my mother's in New York. I infer that based on what I see. I look, I see Richard. When I conclude that Richard's here, it's just because I see it. That's not an inference. That belief is just based on the perceptual experience. And then we have our more complicated inferential beliefs. My belief that there are philosophy students, that there are at least 20 philosophy students in Bergen, is an inference based on many individual perceptions. It didn't involve my actually seeing 20, well, I guess I better make that number larger, 40 philosophy students at one time. So we have the objects. They cause us to sense things. That causes us, and we want to still say cause, us to have a perceptual experience. That gives rise to an inferential belief. That gives rise to a non-inferential belief. That gives rise to inferential. How should we understand these arrows? Lewis is saying, this has to be a causal arrow. And that alone can't give you any constraint. The empiricists act as if you could just make this arrow go straight to here, and somehow you have these non-inferential beliefs, that there's a triangle in front of you. That's not going to work. This belief here, from your perceptual experience to your belief that there is something, that's a conceptually structured justification. That's a, this is a reason for believing that. That's one way to call it, saying what this kind of arrow is. Why do you think Richards is wrong? Because I can see him. That's my reason. And Lewis says, if we're not going to get into trouble here, we need some other way to say what this arrow is. There's an arrow here that's got to ground this. Can't merely be a cause, but can't be a reason. This has the grammar, if you will, the logic of mere efficient causation. This has the grammar or the logic, if you will, of rationalization, things being reasons for each other, logically structured space. This has to be another kind of space. It has to have, if you will, a sui generis logical grammar. That's a very generic way to put what Lewis thought. Then Lewis tries to tell a story about that in terms of Grellian. That story collapses, later people thought. If there's nothing here, we got a big problem. This is Kantian skepticism, if we can't get the top of the board and the bottom of the board together. So the question is, how do you fill this in? Or do you redraw the picture? A lot of philosophers are trying to fill this in. You know, non-conceptual content itself is just or informational content. It's just a fancy name for a way of trying to tell a story, which this arrow can do work. Different details in Lewis. But to that extent, they share his picture. Other people, what Grandham and Davidson try to do is tell a story in which they say, any version of this, Rorty's a case of this too, in much detail, this arrow is always just a hopeless amalgamation of these two arrows. So they try to say, no, we really, you know, there's sensations, they're not very interesting. But then the things just also stand in causal relations to our perceptual beliefs. And that's okay, and justification all happens within here. And a lot of people think, no, very problem Lewis said in quotation two. This is an empty story about concepts. Empty in the Kantian sense of empty. Coherentism in the names of the critics that are saying it's mere coherence. And mere coherence doesn't give you a picture of the world. That's one kind of solution.